Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hello, mental note takers. I'm glad that you're tuning in to another episode of the Make a Mental Note podcast. My mental health tip for the day has to do with high-tech solutions to forgetfulness. And this is a good topic because today's podcast pertains to attention deficit disorder, and you may know that people who suffer from this disorder oftentimes have problems remembering things. Well, here are a couple of things that you can do to help yourself if you don't remember things very well, or even have difficulty keeping yourself organized. And these tips have to do with using your smartphone. First thing that you could do is use the calendar function to help with remembering and organizing events and things that you need to do on a daily basis. And you can set the calendar so that it'll send you different types of alerts of things that need to be done on certain days. There are also organizer apps that'll send you text messages or emails to remind you of important appointments or things to do. In fact, rememberthemilk.com is a website where you can go to get this set up, or they even have apps, and other apps are available too. Smartphones also have a locations reminder feature, or you can get an app that will remind you to do certain things when you leave places or arrive home or at work. Like the app might remind you to feed the dog, or call the dentist to make a dentist appointment when you pull into the driveway of your house. So if you have trouble remembering things, give one of these things a try and see how it works for you. Okay, without further ado, let's get to the podcast with Pamela Drury. Hello again, everyone, to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm Chris Quarto, your host, and I'm so glad you've chosen to listen to another episode of the podcast. Believe me, I don't take you for granted, and I know that there's a lot of other podcasts you could be listening to, so thank you. Well, today I'm joined by Pamela Drury, who's a licensed clinical neuropsychologist and is board certified in neurotherapy. She works at Neurobehavioral Associates of Nashville in Brentwood, Tennessee. And Pamela, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, well, thanks for
be on today.
Yeah, thanks for coming and being part of this today. And one of the things I like to do with these interviews is just to get let the mental note taking audience find out a little bit more about the guest. So maybe you could share who you are and what you do for a living.
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical neuropsychologist. That means that I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in brain-behavior relationships.
Okay.
A lot of people may not understand exactly what a neuropsychologist does, but it's just a clinical psychologist with some additional specialization.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a pretty fancy name there. I'm sure that some of the audience members had never heard that before, but my guess is that it's on the top of the clinical psychology. There was a lot of stuff you had to do for that kind of training, so I'm glad that you explained that.
Yeah.
So, well, why is it that you went into the helping profession? I mean, you could have done a lot of things, all of us could, but I'm kind of interested in hearing your story, Pamela. So maybe if you could share a little bit about how you got involved in this field.
Yeah, I think my story is a little unusual for most of the people in our field.
Mm-hmm.
I came about in a more roundabout way.
All right.
Straight out of college, I knew I was interested in the brain.
Okay.
And so I started out doing research. I went to graduate school at Vanderbilt in the Department of Psychology,
mm-hmm.
Studying neuroscience, which is just the study of the brain. That was during the decade of the brain. That was the big movement during the 90s. And at that time, I was studying how the brain is organized into different regions and how the brain changes in different situations, such as after an injury or when someone's learning, does the brain change during that? So I ended up getting my PhD in experimental psychology. So while I was a scientist, I went to Duke University or Duke Medical Center to do research in the Department of Neurobiology.
Okay.
And as I'm doing this, I'm finding myself getting deeper and deeper into the catacombs of a research lab.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, where are all the people? I'm on my computer all day. And I felt like I was getting way too far away from my roots in psychology.
Sure.
So after a little soul searching and a great conversation I had with my mother, who knows me better than anyone, I decided that I could respecialize in clinical psychology. So I went back to school and got that additional training. And of course, becoming a neuropsychologist was a no-brainer, no pun intended. A little geek humor there.
Yes.
And then as I learned more and more about neurofeedback or neurotherapy, I realized that this was the perfect way that I could combine my knowledge of the brain and how it's organized and how it works with a clinical population to actually help people who are struggling with this knowledge that we've gained. So finally, I sort of landed where I think I was meant to be, and so that was my roundabout path to the healthcare profession.
Wow, when you said unusual, you weren't kidding, were you? That's you've got a lot of education under your belt, obviously.
Yes. When I tell kids how many years I went to school, their eyes cross and they glaze over. And I'm like, you don't have to, I promise.
Yes. It's like, how could you do that?
I ask myself that sometimes, but in the end, it all turned out. I'm very happy now.
Well, yeah, and that's the truth, because you look back at all those years of schooling, and now you see what you're doing, and it seems to be really benefiting you, the services that you're able to provide, and all these kids that you've been able to help, and and in those kids that you've seen. And by the way, what are the ages of the kids or clients that you see? I forgot to ask you that.
Yeah, well, I really see all ages.
Okay.
If you have a brain, you can usually benefit.
Okay.
But usually at least 5 years old, because the clients do have to sit still for an extended period of time. Well, 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Okay.
And so usually 5 years and older. I've worked with patients in their 80s.
Wow.
So really, any of those ages, we just use different, a different approach and different movies, which is something I'll talk about in just a minute.
Okay. All right. Well, and so you've seen clients across the lifespan. And in all those clients that you've seen, do you find that there are those, common themes or stories that seem to underlie their problems? I mean, what's your take on why they have those problems?
Yeah, well, my conceptualization, I'll warn you, will always come back to the brain. That's just how I think. So I conceptualize a lot of different conditions, including ADHD, anxiety, depression, as an issue with the brain. We're starting to understand what exactly those issues are. For a long time, we thought of them as imbalances in neurochemicals, which led to the big pharmaceutical boom.
Right.
The way I conceptualize it these days is based on the brain activity, the electrical activity that's actually going on in the brain.
Okay.
And with ADHD specifically, for example, if we look at an EEG of someone who has ADHD, we can actually see differences in their pattern of brain activity when we compare it to people with quote-unquote normal brains. I don't know if there is such a thing as a normal brain out there, but definitely we have a database of healthy brains, people without a diagnosis of ADHD or a neurological problem or no psychiatric problems. And when we look at someone with ADHD and we look at their EEG, it looks very different than one of these typically developing brains.
Okay.
And so if you can teach somebody to change that activity so that their brain now looks more like someone without ADHD that's in this normal database we have, their symptoms get better.
Okay.
And so we've been able to, so my conceptualization of all these different conditions is that the brain activity somehow is dysregulated. It's not firing the way a nice, healthy, well-functioning brain is firing.
All right. So in a sense, the brainwave activity is not as consistent, perhaps, as you might see in a normal brain. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, it can be that it has more variability. When we look at the EEG, we're looking at just squiggly lines that represent the electrical activity in the brain.
Yeah.
And if you split that squiggly line up into all the different wavelengths or frequencies, we get slow activity. We can look at fast activity, and what we find in people with ADHD, a lot of people, is that they have more of the slow activity than normal and less of the fast activity than normal. And this is something we've known since the 70s. There was I think it was the 70s who did this, but or in the 80s maybe at UT in Knoxville.
Yeah, Lubar.
Joel Lubar. Yeah, he discovered that the theta-beta ratio is what it's called, and it's a sort of a signature pattern for ADHD. An interesting thing is now that as we're using different technologies, we're starting to see other patterns, like kind of different flavors of ADHD. And that is in sync with some of the other research that's going on right now and what people are describing. So it can be a lot of different, I mean, it's not always the same pattern,
right,
but we almost always see that there's something there's too much of something or too little of something that we can help people correct that, and they get better.
But the interesting thing is that I heard you say about the brainwave activity with the ADHD population is that I think I heard you say that it was a slower activity. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, there's a frequency of brain activity that we can pick up with EEG. It's called a theta wave, and we all have it. We all have it as we're falling asleep. It starts to increase when we recall a memory. Sometimes there's a brief little burst of it. But and so everyone has it, and at any given time, we're producing a certain amount of it. With people who have ADHD, often there's more of that than normal in the frontal lobes of the brain. So in the front part of the brain, that part of the brain is responsible for organization, initiation of actions, executive functions, a lot of the same issues that people with ADHD are struggling with. And so that part of the brain has more slow activity.
Okay.
Than a normal healthy brain of someone the same age.
So slower activity would mean less activity. Is that correct?
Nope, not necessarily.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So imagine. No, not imagine. I'm trying to think of how to describe this. Think about when you take light, white light, and you shine it through a prism. It divides it into all the different wavelengths.
Okay.
And we get a rainbow.
Sure.
That's what we're doing with an EEG, so that we can get the slow activity, which I think would be on the red end if it were light, and you go on with different frequency groups that go all the way up to the fastest activity. And there are 5 major groups. So you can have more or less of either of those, of any of those. And so there are some people who have too little theta.
All right.
Okay, and so it's just because there's slow activity, it doesn't mean that there's less of it. It is referred to often as less activity or more activity. That's not technically correct, but I'm okay with you saying that because it gets very, very complicated.
Well, let me put it this way: is it true that with those larger brain waves, and I think they might be called, are they called delta waves perhaps, that those would be the types of waves that you would more likely see like during sleep, like during a very deep sleep, that a person would be producing those large waves. And so what you're saying is that in a similar way with ADHD, with some ADHD clients, that you would see those types of waves like you would with a person who might be in a deep sleep, although they're not asleep, obviously. But you might be likely see those types of waves in an ADHD population.
Right. I mean, that's right. It's actually the next frequency up, theta, is a little bit faster than delta. Theta is typically, that state that you're in just before you fall asleep.
Yeah.
Or you actually are asleep, but if someone woke you, you would say, no, I wasn't asleep.
Right.
That's theta.
Okay.
But it's also associated with kind of spacing out, zoning out.
Okay.
And so if you have too much of that, when you should be focused, and the focused frequency is called beta, it's much faster.
All right.
So when you're sitting in class and you're waiting for the teacher to tell you which pages to do in your workbook this week, and you have a burst of theta, we think that little period you zone out, you miss that information. We think that that's what's going on when there's inattention.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so when someone kind of zones out and misses it, we think that it's, there's too much theta at that moment. So
now we know a little bit more about these different types of waves. So now let's talk about kids or anybody, I guess. Let's stick with the ADHD population. They come in to see you for services, and so you, I imagine you would probably get some sort of a baseline just to find out what their typical brainwave activity is. And you would get that with an EEG, that's kind of like the printout, let's say, of that wave activity. And so you would get that information. And then where do you go from there after you get that baseline information from your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's most people would have no idea how to go from that to changing their brain.
Yeah.
So what we do when someone first comes in, I first of all will get an idea of what kind of problems they're having.
Okay.
A good description of that, and then we get, it's called a quantitative EEG. So it's a QEEG. That's different than what a neurologist would use to diagnose a seizure, where they just eyeball it. A quantitative EEG is the process of sending it through that filter, just like the light going through the prism. The quantitative EEG splits it into those different waves, and from that we get these nice pictures of brain maps.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask you before we even go on any farther. How is it that you're getting this information? I mean, are they kind of hooked up somehow, or how does that part work? And then maybe you can continue.
Okay, yeah. There's so when someone comes in for their quantitative EEG, we use a cap. It looks like a swimming cap. It's not quite as tight as a swimming cap, but it has 19 little electrodes that just sit on top of the scalp.
All
And
right.
these are sensors. They only pick up the electrical activity. They don't give off electrical
They don't
activity.
shock the person, right?
They don't shock you. That's often the question I get. Are you going to shock me with that?
Yeah.
No. So I say these little electrodes are just listening to your brain for a few minutes.
Okay.
And so, yes, we have a cap with electrodes in it. We hook them up. We collect that data. We do 5 minutes with someone just sitting quietly with their eyes closed, and then 5 minutes where they're sitting quietly with their eyes open. And then I can take, after they leave, I take that data and I pick out the really good parts and that don't have, movement artifact or eye blinking or anything that's going to throw the recording off. I take that good data, and that's what I compare to the normal database. And from that, we derive these brain maps where I can show someone on a three-dimensional image of a brain, this area is where you have too much theta or too little beta or something like that. And so I would bring the person back in, go over these results with them, kind of help them to understand what it means, and then we start the training phase.
All right.
And that's where the change starts. So based on that assessment that I did, I know what they have too much or too little of, and I know what the target is, where I want their brain to be. So let's say they have too much theta, and I want them to reduce the amount of theta. So I can set my software so that they get a reward anytime they are producing less theta, and the reward goes away when they start producing more theta. And so when they come in for their training, we put the cap back on them, hook them up, and we're getting the EEG signal constantly, and we're giving them feedback about what their brain is doing in real time.
Okay. So basically, the clients are coming in, you call it training. So, and I assume that they come in a series of sessions for this. Is that correct?
That's correct. Because this is based on or dependent on a learning process, they have to come in with a regular frequency and for multiple sessions. So typically, I really don't see results if people don't do at least twice a week, and that's consistent throughout the field. And typically 20 to 40 sessions.
All right.
People will get where they want to be. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but I usually tell people plan on 20 to 30 sessions, and we'll just keep monitoring and adjust it as we need to.
So you're really helping them change their brainwave activity in a sense, that you're trying to get them from point A, which is where they're coming in with, and I'm probably going to mess this up. Was it the theta activity? That's the kind of activity where, well, they're showing that a lot, and that's kind of what's leading to the problems with attention and, whatever the case. And then you're trying to get them to point B in the end, which is a different type of brainwave activity, and I don't remember what you called it, but it would be more consistent with greater attentiveness, less distractibility, things of that nature.
Right.
And it might take anywhere between 20 and 40 sessions to do that.
Yeah. Again, I'm not doing anything to the brain.
All right.
What I'm doing is I'm allowing someone access to information they normally wouldn't have. So think about if you've ever gone to the gym and want a heart rate monitor. You're walking on the treadmill, and it says, oh, you're not in the fat burning zone yet. You need to ramp it up and walk faster.
All right.
Okay. And so I use that information from my heart rate monitor to modify my behavior.
Okay.
Okay? That's the same thing we're doing with neurofeedback. With the EEG, I'm giving people information about what their brain is doing. Now, if I wanted to, I could show them an image of, it's an image of a brain with their activity superimposed on it.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that is too much turns red, anything that's just right is green, anything that's too little is blue. And so I can show them the image of this brain and say, here's your brain, make it turn green.
All right.
So again, I'm giving them feedback about what their brain is doing that they normally wouldn't have access to. So I can't tell a person how to change their brain.
Mm-hmm.
I can just show them what it's doing, and they kind of figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a conscious learning.
Right.
I've heard people describe it as it's a felt sense,
Uh-huh.
which I love that term. And over sessions, people just kind of figure it out, or the brain figures it out, regardless of what you're doing.
And they're doing all of this in front of a computer, right? I mean, that's kind of how they're watching the computer screen, and that's providing them, whatever the software you're using. I'm not exactly what it is, but that's kind of what's providing them with the feedback as to how they're doing. Is that correct?
That's correct. You can make the feedback be anything you want that the software is capable of doing. So you can show them a brain. Now we have that technology, and some people really like doing that. Traditionally, there have been video games that sort of go when you're meeting the requirement or meeting the demand, and they stop when you don't. Now kids, the video games are so much more sophisticated than the ones we have access to with this software.
Uh-huh.
It's like playing Pong.
Yeah.
You remember Pong?
Oh yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah. Well, I think I remember.
Yeah.
I think I remember watching one of these before many years ago, where the child who was hooked up and they were trying to do this training, where they had to keep they were flying a plane was flying above water, and they had to try to keep the plane above the water. I think that's what the deal was. Yeah.
Right. And there's one with a dolphin, and so a lot of games like that. And some people actually prefer those. But what most people use now, or in my clinic at least, what we're doing is, excuse me, in my clinic what we're doing is I have a TV on my wall, and I play a DVD, a movie. And when the person is meeting the demand, so they're within the target zone, a movie's playing normally, but when they start to drift off and maybe produce more of that theta, the movie starts to fade in brightness and the volume goes down.
Okay.
So that's how they get their reinforcement.
I see.
So a person really doesn't have to think about what their brain is doing. They just come in and watch the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, if the movie's starting to fade a little bit, your brain is naturally going to try to figure out how to make it come back, whether you're consciously thinking of that or not.
Right. Right. Well, what are the challenges in doing something like this? I can imagine, when you first start off, maybe that a client says, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm wondering, that's got to be a challenge, but there are probably other challenges too. Why don't you speak a little bit about that, Pamela?
Yeah, I think that it's very important for the person to want to do this because it's labor intensive. The people are coming here twice a week at least. Mm-hmm. I've had people coming in every day for several weeks. Mm-hmm. And so if they're really not into it and don't want to be there, it's probably not going to work. Mm-hmm. I've had just a few, usually, adolescents who are there because their parents made them come. They end up dropping out before they can see any changes.
Right.
So I think just the logistics of it is the most challenging part. Initially getting people to understand it. I mean, as we've talked about it today, there's a lot of information. Mm-hmm. And, I started off with years of schooling behind me, and it took me 2 years to feel really comfortable with this.
Right.
So just getting people to understand, or giving them the amount of information that they want, is a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
And so
I was just going to add that I imagined, kind of like what you were saying, that if a person really wants to do this, they have to be motivated, don't they? I mean, there's a lot of personal investment in doing something like this, and you kind of weigh this against the whole medication thing, where you could see a result in a half an hour after taking a pill. So why would a person want to go this route, spending all this time, all this effort on something like this, as opposed to just going this easy medication route? I mean, why would they want to go this route, Pamela?
Well, a lot of the people that come to me are, they want to use medication as a last resort. I think the medications we're giving are safe, but we're not sure. I don't think we really understand what all of the medications are doing to the developing brain. So I think people are starting to be more and more concerned about that. The other thing with the psychostimulants that are used for ADHD, there's some problems with weight loss and not growing as quickly as they would if they were off the medication. So some parents have concerns with that. Another issue is that often the longer a child is on the medications, the doctors have to keep upping the dose, kind of chasing the symptoms. And sometimes they'll even add in like a big, heavy-duty medication, like an antipsychotic. We're getting more and more kids on antipsychotics, and we certainly don't know what those are doing to the developing brain. So for people who are reluctant to start their child on medications, this is a great alternative. Kids who are on medications can actually benefit from it as well. I'm working with some who are on medications and had started to have that dosage creep up, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to make sure they stayed at the same dose. So I worked with this family on that, and they were able to. So that's one issue, but the other one is that we think we have every indication that once these changes have happened in the brain, they stick. They maintain over time. And so the longest research, and again, this was Joel Lubar who did this, the longest study was 20 years after neurofeedback, and when they went back and asked the clients, they reported that the symptoms did not come back.
Wow, that is impressive.
In most of the patients, right. And the idea is that it's almost like the brain, there's something that's off track, and what neurofeedback helps get it back on track, and then it flourishes from that point on. Oftentimes people will continue to improve after they finish. So we just want to make sure they get enough sessions in so that they're back on that right track. And then, it's very rare that someone has to come back in for a booster session.
Right. Yeah, I was just on another podcast this morning, and talking about how there's really a cost-benefit analysis that parents have to do when they make these kinds of decisions. And in this case in particular, if you look at the long-term benefits of neurofeedback, in particular in that research that you were just citing about Lubar, the possibility that these symptoms may reduce to the point where they don't need medication anymore, and I'm not sure if we could say they're symptom-free, but at least to the point where they can manage on their own, where they don't require the medication anymore. That's really powerful, isn't it?
It really is. It's so exciting to see when that happens as well. That all the struggles that were going on, I love working with children with ADHD because they are so creative and the interactive. I just love working with them. And you think if this child had just a little boost, they just think about what they could do.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it's amazing what it can open up.
Yeah. And you're right. And I think that something like this really helps them, achieve at their true potential, whatever it is, school or whatever it is that we're talking about. Well, talk a little bit about, what is it about you or the way that you do your work that would draw clients to you, Pamela?
Well, as we've mentioned, neurofeedback is starting to get more and more recognition in the media. I pulled up a Dr. Phil video on it. So if Dr. Phil is talking about it, everybody knows about it. That was the pre-podcast era.
Sure, yeah.
And also we're getting better and better research. Some of the academic centers are starting to do research, and there was an article published in Pediatrics, which is the journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, that showed 6 months after ending neurofeedback, the results were still there. There have been studies that show that it's just as good as medications. So with all of this research coming out and more attention in the media, it is growing in popularity. And there are a lot of neurofeedback centers that are popping up. And there are a lot of people with very different levels of training who are providing neurofeedback.
Okay.
And so I always recommend that people check with the organization that is responsible for certifying people in neurofeedback.
All right.
And that's called the Biofeedback Certification International Alliance.
Okay.
And you can go online to their website, bcia.org.
All right.
And you can find people who are board certified in your area. And so they make sure that people meet the minimum requirements that they feel is necessary for neurofeedback. So, for example, they will only board certify someone who is a healthcare provider licensed in their state.
All right.
So there are actually people out there who are providing neurofeedback who do not have licenses, healthcare provider licenses.
I see.
And so you want to make sure that if you're treating a clinical condition, that the person you're seeing has training to treat that condition, that they are licensed, again, by their state board, and that they've had appropriate training in neurofeedback specifically, which is what the BCIA does. They spell out exactly the type of training that you should have. I personally believe that the person providing neurofeedback should be trained in the conditions they're treating. They also should have a good understanding of brain organization and function, and also in learning theory. So, of course, I'm a little bit biased. I think the perfect person to do it is a neuropsychologist.
Sure.
We just happen to have all of that. And biofeedback in general has been under the umbrella of psychology for years. And so, biofeedback with the additional focus on the brain, again, a neuropsychologist is someone that will have all of that training.
Right.
Actually, a neuropsychologist wouldn't necessarily have all of that training. They have the background knowledge, but they would have to get additional training in neurofeedback.
So with the neurofeedback or the biofeedback, we're not talking about snake oil. We're talking about evidence-based practice. And this is something that's been done for quite a long time, and something that's really showing some fantastic results.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so important that people who are well qualified provide the services, because if you have Joe Schmo down the road, opening up a center and buying some equipment and providing it, he may or may not get good results. And then it reflects badly on the field. People will make claims that it's not working.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very important to have qualified, well-trained people who are providing this. And there are a lot of people in the field, certainly people who've been doing this much longer than me, who are in other specialties, who are not neuropsychologists. Mm-hmm. But again, you want to make sure that the person is in some kind of health care field and that they've had the training that's appropriate for treating the brain and the condition that you're.
And we'll make sure and put the information that you were talking about. I believe it was the BCIA.
BCIA.org.
Okay, and we'll put that in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go there to get information about that, check out practitioners, they'll be able to get that information. Well, in this
that's a really great resource.
Okay. In this last part of the podcast, Pamela, we call it Make a Mental Note, and it's just a way for our guests to provide tips or suggestions to the audience about things that they might be able to do to improve their mental wellness or relationships. What do you have in mind along those lines?
Well, I think there are a lot of things you can do to improve your brain health. The research coming out of nutrition right now is just, it's turning everything upside down, all the things we thought we understood about the brain. Mm-hmm. So, we're learning there's more serotonin in your gut than in your brain.
Wow.
That's one of the chemicals that we know, it's what Prozac works on.
Uh-huh.
So it's pretty amazing the things we're starting to learn about nutrition. So having good nutrition, eating healthy foods, and, you can go on this diet or that diet, but I really tell people cut out the processed foods, limit your sugar, take lots of fish oils because the fat in the fish oil is what the brain runs on.
Uh-huh.
Having a good probiotic on board to keep your gut healthy because anything bad that we eat gets absorbed into the bloodstream in the gut, and guess where it can go? It can go to the brain.
Sure, yeah.
And so healthy gut, healthy brain.
Yes, yeah.
And then the other thing is exercise. It's amazing the results people can get from just doing a little bit of cardio exercise, a little bit of weight training. So we know that attention improves with cardiovascular activity. There was a school that implemented a cardio program before school in the mornings, and their scores went up, and they ended up competing in this international competition, and they won. And Americans had never won this.
How about that?
It's really amazing. If you want to learn more about that, there's a great book called Spark.
Okay.
And he talks about the effects of exercise on the brain. So those are ways to have good fueling for the brain, just general brain wellness.
Yeah.
But of course, neurofeedback.
Uh-huh.
If your brain's not functioning as well as you think it could, we can tweak that. We can teach you to what we know now is that we can learn to actually change the way our brain's functioning so that our functioning in the real world is better.
Right. Well, that's exciting to hear. I really like how the field has evolved and how we're finding out more about what we can do to help people not only become more aware of brainwave activity, but change that to enhance their brain functioning. And I appreciate what you said just about some of those things that I think a lot of us take for granted, eating healthily and getting exercise, and how that really plays an important role in brain health as well. And we had talked about that on previous episodes, even about the importance of just doing those real basic foundation things like I said that we take for granted. They really are important for health, and especially for brain health, from what I hear you saying.
Right.
So, well, Pamela, if somebody is interested in seeking you out for services, whether it's a parent or an adult, how can they contact you?
Well, there are a number of ways to reach me. Of course, you can call the clinic. The number is 615-761-9925.
All right.
If we're not available at that moment, just leave a message. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. There's also the website, and there's more information about what we do here on the website as well. That is www.nbanashville.com. That's N as in Nancy, B as in boy, A as in apple, Nashville.com. And if you want to learn more about neurofeedback and actually see someone hooked up and doing neurofeedback, go on YouTube, check out my video there. You can do a search either for Neurobehavioral Associates of Nashville, or I think if you do a search for Nashville Neurofeedback, I think it comes up there too. I actually have a model, a friend who let me hook her up, and so we could see what's going on, so people can actually see what happens during the session.
All right.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then if you just want to shoot me an email, you don't want to put a lot of clinical personal information in that, but if you want to shoot me an email to set up something, you can reach me at Dr. Drury at nbanashville.com. So that's doctor is in the abbreviation. So DRDRURY at nbanashville.com.
Fantastic. And we'll put all your contact information in the show notes as well, so people can find you easily and get a hold of you if they need to. So.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Well, Pamela, thank you so much for joining us today. I've learned a lot, and I think the audience would agree about this whole area of neurofeedback and all the exciting things that are taking place in the field, and especially looking at this as an alternative for medication for parents who do have concerns about placing their kids on medicine, that this is really a nice alternative for them that can have long-lasting results. So I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Well, it has been a delight, and I'm always very excited to talk about this. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Well, have a good rest of the day, Pamela.
You too.
Okay, thanks. Okay, that was a great interview with Pamela. I like the fact that this is a new approach, neurofeedback. It's actually not that new. It's been around for many years. I was in practice with a psychologist who was using this in the 1990s. But I say new because in comparison to other approaches that have been around for many years, like stimulant medication or behavior modification strategies, this is sort of like the new kid on the block. And I like the fact that it's an evidence-based treatment approach. It uses learning principles like reinforcement and shaping to help clients bring about changes and improvements in brain function. And that actually pertains to my question for the day. Pamela had talked about a type of brainwave activity that people with attention deficit disorder show at higher rates than people without this disorder. Do you remember what the name of that brainwave activity was? It was called theta brainwave activity, and this is the type of activity that usually occurs when a person has just nodded off or fallen asleep, but you can wake them up pretty easily. Well, people with ADHD will oftentimes display higher rates of theta brainwave activity when they're monitored with an EEG, although they're obviously not asleep. So if you have too much of this type of activity, it doesn't allow a person to remain focused on tasks or to be mentally alert or to process information very quickly and efficiently. So the idea is to help a person decrease theta brainwave activity and to increase beta brainwave activity, which is much faster and which is associated with increased attentiveness, improved focus and alertness, and these types of things. So it's really neat to learn about this in today's podcast. Well, if you like the show notes for today's podcast episode, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. My last name is spelled Quarto. That's chrisquarto.com. And once again, if you like what you heard today, please continue to spread the word. Get the word out on Facebook and Twitter so your family, so friends, other people that you know can benefit from the information that's provided on these podcasts. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the week.